Hello again, everybody. This is Fred Kranz from St. Ange, here with another episode of Taking the Supply Chain Pulse. Today, we have a first, the first St. Ange employee to be featured in our podcast series. From time to time, I want to bring together the people that we have that serve your organizations so you can learn about them, learn about us, and see what experiences and insights they bring to your organization. So today we will be speaking with Ash Crowe, a director in healthcare. She's been with St. Ange since 2016. Ash, great to have you here.
Great. Thanks for the welcome, Fred. It's great to be here.
Good. Well, I know that you have an extremely interesting history because you're a person like me that's probably worked in about five different aspects of healthcare, which gives
Yeah,
you a much greater perspective than a lot of people have. So why don't you tell us about your background, how you got to where you are today?
sure. So my story of kind of how I got to healthcare and where I am today actually starts a little before I was in healthcare. So when I graduated from college, I was, like a lot of folks, looking for a job and was able to get a job I graduated from college at Duke. So I was in the Triangle area. I got a job at NC State working as a grants administrator for the Department of Plant Pathology. So it was a lot of experience, a lot of learning how to work with this various personalities, writing grants. And I was there about 5 years. And while I was there, had a hard time kind of explaining to people what it was doing. It was raising funds so our scientists in plant pathology could really work on, kind of improving plant disease, other things of that nature. And while I was doing that, my younger sister was going through the process of applying to med school. I happened to, while I was working in NC State, get a really wonderful grant, but it was to help with the production of tobacco, and kind of felt a call to kind of move towards something that was maybe a little more mission driven towards health than working with tobacco science and things of that nature. So went while my sister was applying for medical school, went and kind of looked to see how I could take some of my organizational skills and other things like that and apply them in healthcare. So I actually applied to and went to Johns Hopkins in the what is now the MHA program. At the time, it was a master's in health science and health finance and management. Great program, really learned a lot there. And the other thing I really learned there with that program is you do a residency as the second year of the program. So you go out and you're an administrative resident in a department. And I had the good luck to match there for my residency with perioperative services. So other than as a patient, when I was in grad school, that was really the first time I stepped into the OR. And I had one of the more unique residencies of anybody I've talked to. About 2 weeks before I was due to start my residency in periop, which I was going to be looking at, schedules, working on some of the logistics, periop, kind of that whole group that surrounds everything in the OR. My preceptor, who then went on to be my boss, took me out to lunch, and he said, "Hey, so something's happened, and we had to let go our surgery supply chain manager. So as you're coming into the department, that's going to be an opening. So why don't we kind of look at you doing that for a large portion of your residency?" So I was there as an administrative resident, didn't know anything, and I was kind of managing the surgery supply chain that served 23 ORs and 54 anesthesia ORs, and managing everything from in-room restocking to restocking the anesthesia carts to building case cart, and really got a great kind of trial by fire. Let's see how an OR works. Let's see how supply chain works. Kind of experience. I absolutely fell in love with being in that environment, working there, working at Hopkins, working for my boss, who's Bob Shue, and just had a really, really wonderful time. So much so that when I finished my residency, I accepted that as a full-time position and stayed there at Hopkins, working in and around perioperative services and supply chain, interfacing with sterile processing, doing that work for about 5 years. My last winter at Hopkins, a lot of snow. You probably tell my accent. I am not from the Mid-Atlantic. It was time for me to go home to somewhere where it didn't snow quite as often. So I left Baltimore at that point and moved back to Durham, North Carolina. I worked at Duke University and moved out of the OR for a while. I moved to a distributed materials and linen role. So I had the staff and the loan program that was restocking all the clinical units with supplies and with linen in every department in the hospital where they got things through our distribution. Had a really great experience there working at Duke, got to see some buildings come up, get involved in some of the design process, which was also awesome. And for my next role, I kind of wanted to be able to kind of get a little bit more breadth, right? I'd had these two jobs where I was very focused, one in the OR and then one focused across the whole hospital, but just on kind of materials and linen distribution. So for my next role, I moved to South Carolina and was a director of supply chain at what's now MUSC Florence. At the time, it was Carolina's Health System Florence. So it was a CHS hospital when I worked there. Shortly after I left, CHS sold the South Carolina hospitals to MUSC. So that's now MUSC Florence Hospital. And I came to St. Ange right there from Florence. The kind of the motivation for me is while I really loved being an operations manager, whether it was in director, whether it was in the OR or in distributed materials or in managing a whole department, there's kind of the operational manager grind where you don't really feel like you're getting a chance to make a lot of those bigger improvements. And really what you're working on is there's this back order, there's this call out, there's this surgeon that wants something new. And so much of your time is taken up with operations management. And I really wanted an opportunity to come somewhere where I could work on projects and really kind of making a difference in kind of the long term of how hospitals are going to work. And so that's what I was looking for when I came to St. Ange. And I've been somebody for the last 8 years who's been extraordinarily lucky because I get to do just that. I get to work on process improvement projects with hospitals, and I get to work on new construction projects with hospitals to really help them figure out kind of what the world wants to look like, whether it is, the good luck of, fortune of having a new building built, or it's, hey, we have our current space and we need to work to optimize what we have. And it's been a really wonderful experience for me. I get to use a lot of my kind of hospital expertise, particularly in the OR and sterile processing areas, and kind of really grow what we're able to do in those areas, and really have been able to learn kind of all the ways that we can use the data that's in hospitals to help make better improvements. And that's a lot of what I get to do here at St. Ange, and get to work with a great team that I have. And we've really built a really nice community of the work we can do. And I feel like we're really getting to make a difference in the way hospitals are laid out, the way they're set up, what employees' daily lives look like, and all towards the end of making sure we can have hospitals have better patient care. So that's my, it's not a 5-second story there, but that's my kind of story and journey for how I got from where I started to where I am today.
That's pretty good. We, realize it, but you and I have a few things in common. Number one, we both got bachelor degrees in history
Yes,
from ACC schools, by the way.
absolutely.
And number two, my first supply chain work was to manage the second and third floor non-clinical activities at Baptist Hospital in Miami, which included labor and delivery, surgery, and a regular med surg unit. So I was managing those. My first directorship was in central processing and distribution with exactly the same functions you had, including linen. I also had the print shop. So it's really interesting that we
Yeah.
have that. And the thing that you said in here that jumped out at me, and the reason that organizations need to ask for outside help is so much of your time was spent on transactional stuff, basically doing things so you didn't get yelled at by the physicians, that you had no time to actually get into developmental project work. And I think most organizations today are still probably 99% transactional. Their days are taking up with getting the work done, and they have neither the staff nor the resources nor the time to be able to address things. So when you go into a project, we're trying to solve problems for today, but we need to be aware of the future. And I wrote this down, said we never know exactly what's going to change in the next few decades, but individual hospitals are going to be around for 50 years. If you build a new hospital, it should have a horizon of 50 years plus. What strategies do you typically see for planning the hospital to flexibly support the unknown in a way that doesn't overly burden a project today?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Those first ORs I worked in Hopkins, they were about 50 years old. The building doesn't have ORs anymore, but it was a Hopkins building that was named for Dale Carnegie. So it was certainly one of the older Hopkins buildings, and we were still there in the I won't date myself too much, but in the 2000s, performing surgeries in a building that was very old. So it's kind of where I came from, is how do you make a very old building work? And I think that's one of the questions as we look to all the buildings we're working on, the hospitals that are getting built today, they will become very old buildings. And I think, there's kind of two things that I see. One is, I think we do see some groups, and it's easy to fall into that conversation of kind of some analysis paralysis, right? You want to think about everything the future space could be and make sure you plan for that, instead of trying to think about, like, well, if this is going to be our space day one, are we leaving ourselves enough space to adapt? Right? I think the tricky part is trying to know everything that's going to be there in 50 years. Having started my career working in a building that was at least 50 years of being ORs, there are so many things that changed in medicine since that building was built to today that no one could ever have dreamed of. If you just go through old ORs and just look at the lack of space for things like equipment, right? The way it's expanded. So there's a lot that we can know, and obviously we need to study and understand kind of what technology is now and what's that next technology that's coming. But there's that kind of beyond what we can think about. So there, you really want to think about, like, how do you make this space flexible, right? Do we have the opportunity to build a building that just has a little bit of empty space in it, that has some shell? Or, one of the things that we see a lot of folks working on now is, can we build this building today, knowing that tomorrow we can add 5 stories to it, right? So we could build the structure of the building such as that for the areas we get really involved in. We could build the loading dock for that new building, not just to match what we know today, but to say, well, what if y'all bolt on a little more? Can we get some of those core infrastructure things designed for that future flexibility? So can we think about, as you go through a building design and building process, right, you get way, way, way more detailed to the point where you're creating the documents that allow the building to be built. And in those, you have kind of every trash can you're going to have day one, every chair, every outlet. And to do everything correctly, we need to have that. But I think we also need to think about, kind of stepping back a little bit from that as we develop it and say, were we building something that could tweak over time? Does this allow us to change? And think about ways we can build that in without having to figure out or know or try to precognate what's going to happen in 50 years exactly. Because if you're out there and you know exactly what's going to happen in healthcare in 50 years, I'm also a bit of a gambler, and I'd love to know what you think is going to happen in sports in 50 years, and we can go put some bets in, right? Nobody can really know that far out in the future, so we need to think about, as we're building new spaces, what it can turn into or could turn into in the future.
Yep. And that I'm not so sure that in the past, when I've been involved with new builds, that I could see that responsibility to the future, if you will, was always present. I think that we were always trying to solve today's problems with probably giving very little attention to what we need to be concerned with for the future. So that's good stuff. So when you start to work on a project, what's the first thing you want to know?
Yeah, Fred, I think it relates a lot to something you said at the beginning, when we were talking, that, so much of healthcare is transactional, but you've got really great managers and really great directors who are there in the current space, who are making it work. And they probably, and almost every time I've done it, they have really great ideas about what they would love for it to be or what that project they would love to work on is. And that's going to inform the process. So for me, the first thing I really want to know is, what does that current area look like? What are your challenges today? What are your dreams for what you would want your department to be? Right? Because I think knowing those challenges is really important, because we can work to address them in the new design. But we also, if we're working on a new layout, but we also don't want to over address them. Right? We've worked with departments, a sterile processing department, where as we work through the design, they say, well, we've got to have 3 cart washers. And we look at it and we have the ability to run some modeling. We say, well, there's no way you're going to need 3 cart washers. Why do you need 3 cart washers? And if we go back to the current state and look, we realize, well, they have 1 now and it's 25 years old and they can't get it replaced. And they're acting out of that fear from what their current has taught them. And they're kind of over planning for the future because of that, right? Or they have some older equipment that's much slower and it's just a constant frustration in their lives. So then they want to say, as we're designing, we need more of that equipment. And they may, given the growth, but there's also something there in the current state that's informing that design in the future. And if you know that, you could kind of work to address some of those, to let people know, what this equipment is, that you're going to have that redundancy. You can have a service plan for that equipment. Some of the things that may be thwarting them in their day-to-day now, and really understanding that, I think it's really important for that reason. And it's also, I'll be honest, some of the best ideas we have for process improvements you can make in a department come from talking to somebody and watching them work, right? They have the idea. It's just they also still have this giant stack of trays, or they have these 10 units that need linen, and they never have the space to really see those ideas grow. So understanding that current state for me is really the first thing I want to know, and not just like what the senior director and VP say about how it works now. I really want to get there, understand from the technicians, frontline managers, how does it really work today?
Yeah, my basic consulting experience has always been in non-salary expense reduction projects, which is different than design, the physical type projects that we do. And probably about 80% of the stuff that you recommend has already been recommended by the employees that are already there. They just don't get listened to. And
Right.
I think your idea of talking to them and getting input from them is really good. So along that same line, what topics or conversations do you feel often come up too late in a design?
I think it is. I think it is some of those things we were talking about early on, right? Like, people are a little too late to think about the future or the flexibility, right? A design process is modern design process very iterative, right? Each time, we set up a series of meetings, meeting with users. Each time we meet, we're going to get more and more detailed, right? So by the time you've gotten very detailed, it feels too late to go back and talk about, well, what could this space be next, right? Because you get down, like I said before, to the point of like, where do all the trash cans in this patient room go, right? By the time you're at that level, winding people's brains back to think about, well, in 20 years, would you want to use it this way, right? So it's really starting to think about some of how you bring that flexibility in early. I think that's definitely one. I think the other one that I see is kind of thinking about, you know, we have some projects where, that it's very late to, we have some projects where it's very late to kind of bring a vendor in. And it's, we're vendor neutral, so we can work with not knowing a vendor or knowing a vendor. But there are some occasions where a vendor may have something in particular that might work, or that might tweak something a little bit. So certainly as that design gets very advanced, knowing that vendor so we can work with exactly that vendor for the layouts and for the design and for the capability allows us to really be on the edge of the technology for what that vendor has. So having that relationship developed too, and making sure we get that before we kind of get to a critical point in the design process is important as well.
Yeah, the vendor neutral, and I would say solution neutral thing is important. When you talked earlier about the folks that wanted 3 cart washers and only needed 2, I thought of a couple things. Number one, if you're in sterile processing, the place has probably not been looked at for 25 or 30 years as it is. And those folks that are there are finally getting some attention and finally getting some money, and they realize this is probably the only shot they're going to have at getting something. So they're going to
Absolutely.
ask for what they want. The second thing is with you talked about senior leadership with opinions but not knowledge about what goes on in a place, and they will go to a meeting and they'll see some type of technology. Oh, we've got to have that for our place, and that technology may be totally unnecessary for them. Could you talk on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of really great technology that's out there. I know I had an opportunity last month to go to the HSPA conference, the big sterile processing conference, and really get a sense of what technology is out there in sterile processing. And every year I go, I'm impressed with some of the new things that we see in a department. And really encourage folks as they're working on, process improvements, both smaller process improvements and those big redesigns, to really look at kind of what technology is out there. And I love knowing what's out there so I can help people with it. But I've yet to see a technology that is you turn on the switch and all your problems are solved, and an easy button doesn't exist in real life, right? So that senior leadership or whoever it is who's like, we got to have this one thing, it's going to save all our problems. It's going to help, right? But it's going to bring its own things. You have to learn how to work with that technology, how that technology works with the other technologies you have, right? Because they're all a benefit, and there are a lot of really great things. Saw some cool things with robotics, saw some cool automations this recently at HSPA. It's really great to see all of that. But all of it then has to integrate in with the people and the work. And I think that's an important part, is making sure you have that step to have it work in your work, and make sure you have the employees and the resources that can really integrate that into what you're doing, right? If it's sterile processing and you have a new technology, it also needs to speak with and work with your tray tracking software. So you don't just end up with, I'm going to misremember it, but there was a study not too long ago that looked at the sheer number of systems a nurse has to go into on a daily basis. And it was somewhere around like 18 different systems. And I think that might be way lowballing that, because I don't remember the number exactly there. But, how do you make it so that, it's all this technology that's making everything work better? It's actually working better in the workflow of what you need, right? How do we make it so the nurse is just going one place and she's able to enter in, how the sterile processing tech, from their perspective, everything works seamlessly, right? I think that piece gets lost a little in if we grab that new technology and we grab that new technology, there's a lot of meshing and work that needs to happen there for it to be a really successful implementation.
Yeah, and I think organizations have to have plans that are fluid and dynamic and revisited on a regular basis, because things change.
Yeah,
Things
absolutely.
the one thing you can guarantee is that something's going to happen out there 2 or 3 years from now that we haven't even thought of yet, and
Yeah.
you need to be able to accomplish melding and working together with that. So, what possibilities for improvement? I'm a supply chain leader at a small to mid level hospital or small IDN. What possibilities for improvement would someone like me most often overlook?
Yeah, I think the one of the ones you overlook is really stepping back and looking at the big picture, right? Like, obviously, there are a lot of people who are involved with their purchasing groups and things like that, where they know kind of their metrics and how they stack up with their metrics. But there's not as much understanding on how you stack up with like the way you're doing it, right? We have in supply chain an absolute wealth of knowledge. We've had a lot of really great people on the podcast, and commend you for that. People who are happy to share kind of what they know. And this is something I wish I'd known earlier in my career, when I was just a materials manager, didn't really know anybody. I've yet to meet somebody who, if I emailed them through, hey, I know this person and they gave me your email address, and it sounds like you know how this works. Can you tell me a little bit more about maybe what can I do here, right? Like, I didn't know until I'd been, working with a loading dock for a bunch of years, that I could work with my purchasing department and work on a schedule for when people showed up at the dock. So everybody didn't come right when my distributor was coming. Nobody ever told me that. So I was just like, well, this is just my daily frustration is I'm just gonna, put on a vest and go out and yell at trucks to get stuff moving, right? Nobody really opened that world to me and said, they're here under a delivery agreement. We could just change the time they come. Would that make your life easier? Yes, absolutely. That would make my life much easier. So, like, that's the biggest thing I see, like, for where do you look for process improvements? I think it's look for where those biggest frustrations are and listen to the frontline staff who are, I'm sure, letting you know what those frustrations are. And if you can't see the answer, get involved with one of the groups or, use LinkedIn and email somebody else and say, hey, do you have this problem? I have this problem. How have you thought to solve it? Right? That nobody in healthcare is here in isolation. And like I said earlier, I know everyone in healthcare is in some way here because we want to see that patient care improve and everyone keeps that end in mind. And so I've rarely, if ever, met somebody who, when I email somebody and ask for advice or run into somebody at a conference or out and say, hey, how are you addressing this? They don't have some good ideas or don't offer some of their time. And I think that's where I would look if I was kind of as a younger manager or somebody managing a small area, talk to my staff, work some routes with the staff, really understand what those frustrations are. And then if you can't piece it together, use the networks that exist or work to build your network to ask, because you might find a problem that no one's addressed before. And for me, if you come to me with a problem I've never seen before, I'm going to be really interested in helping. But for the most, right, because I'm like, wow, this is new. Let's figure this one out. But for the most part, things are similar, and you'll have folks you can turn to who can help with some similar problems.
Yep. Perspective comes from multiple data points, and many people in supply chains, the directors or the VPs may move around, but many times you walk into a hospital, I'm sure it was true at Duke, you'll have 60% of the staff that has only worked at that place all their career and only has one data point of activity that they're familiar with. So that's a point well taken. Well, hey, one question left. What did I forget to ask about that you'd like to talk about?
Trying to think. I think we've covered a lot of topics. I think the one, I hope one of the big pieces here is that, people take away really that the information is all there, right? Your technicians, folks who are working the day to day, they know the frustrations, they know the needs, right? It's really about how do we get those communicated, right? How do we turn that frustration of, hey, I'm feeling this frustration every day. How do we turn that into some data or into something that can be powerful that can help to implement that change? And how do we help to get people a little away from the operational whack-a-mole to really work and help and make those process improvements? And then how do we use all of that to inform the new buildings we build? I think is really kind of what the overarching and the piece for me is.
Great. Well, I just thought of another question, Ash.
Go for it.
I know that you're a football fanatic in the international use of the term football. Okay.
Absolutely.
I know you went to Duke. So I would have to say that you could not have gone to Duke without at least being somewhat familiar with basketball as well, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So who was a better college basketball player, Michael Jordan or Christian Laettner?
College basketball player? I'm only going to I'll answer it with a story. How about that? So not only did I go to Duke, my father also went to Duke. My initials, I'm Ash Crowe. My initials are actually ACC. It's kind of named after the ACC. My father did that on purpose. I love him. I'll answer that by saying when I was in school, when I was young in school, my mom came to the school one day, got me out of school, got my sister out of school, picked my brother up from daycare, told the school there was a family emergency. She piled us all in a car and we went to Charlotte to watch the Duke men's basketball team do their open practice before their regional in Charlotte. And that was that 91-92 team with Christian Laettner. So that's, I don't mean to, I have a lot of really great friends who are UNC fans, but I think if you're just looking at college, what I'll say is there was one person I saw play in person when I was young and he was in college, and that was Laettner. So if I had to pick one, that would be it for me.
Yep, I've gotten in several arguments with people from North Carolina about that. My answer is always this: Michael Jordan was the third best player on his team. He had Worthy and Perkins there as well, and they were both better than him. Laettner made more uh, clutch shots than anybody around, so I appreciate
Yes.
that.
I will
Well,
not. I will not argue it on the pro level, but on the college level, I think we've got a fighting chance with that argument there, Fred.
yeah, well, I was careful with the way I structured my questions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, Ash. Well, hey, this has been a real pleasure, and I appreciate the fact that you took some time out to talk with us. And
Yeah,
hopefully, we're going to have people that are going to make return visits, and I'm sure you will probably be one of those folks. So, thanks
great.
again, and everybody. If you like what you hear, subscribe. If you have any suggestions, let us know about them, and we'd love to have you continue to watch or listen to our podcast. So, Ash, have a good one. Take care. Everybody
Great.
else, we'll see you later. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to our podcast, Taking the Supply Chain Pulse. Subscribe, follow, and give us your comments for topics or improvements. And if you know some people that you think we should be interviewing, please tell us about them too. I can be reached at fcrans, C-R-A-N-S, at stonge, S-T-O-N-G-E.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again. See you next time.